To the world, they were just my grandparents. To me, they were my whole world. But when I discovered the truth they hid, every hug turned into a lie. But then, I made their silence scream loud enough for the world to hear. To the world, they were just my grandparents. Kind, gentle, the couple who always had homemade cookies ready, who donated at every town fundraiser, who smiled even when their bodies ached from age. But to me, they were my entire universe. I was 5 when I lost everything. My parents, gone in what they told me was a terrible, tragic car crash. I didn't understand what death meant back then. All I knew was that I went to sleep in a warm bed one night and woke up in a stranger's house the next morning. Except they weren't strangers. They said they were my grandparents, my mother's parents, and they promised me I'd never be alone again. Their house smelled like old wood and cinnamon. There were rocking chairs, quilts stitched with tiny flowers, and a fireplace that seemed to whisper lullabies at night. They tucked me in, told me stories about angels, made me feel like I was safe again. They let me cry when I needed to. Let me be silent when I couldn't speak. I remember clinging to my grandmother's leg like it was a lifeline. And I remember how my grandfather would hum softly, patting my head, saying, "You're a little light now. You keep us going." I believed them. I had to. Because believing in their love was the only thing keeping me from falling apart. Years passed. They raised me like I was their second chance at joy. My grandmother would brush my hair every morning, braid it tight, and kiss the top of my head. My grandfather built me a swing in the backyard, and every time he pushed me, he'd shout, "Fly, little bird." I laughed. I smiled. I trusted. I called them my angels. Told my teachers how lucky I was to have them. Told my friends that while I didn't have parents, I had the best grandparents in the world. But sometimes, things didn't add up. Like how they always froze when I asked about my mother. Or the way they changed the subject when I asked to visit her grave. "We'll go another day," they said. "Too far," they'd mumble. Eventually, I stopped asking. Still, the love felt real. Birthday cakes with my name spelled in pink. Homemade lunches with heart-shaped sandwiches. Warm hugs that made the world feel small and safe. But there were moments. Little ones. The day I found a locked drawer in my grandmother's old desk. Or the torn photograph I stumbled across in the attic. One where my mother smiled brightly, but someone next to her had been scratched out so viciously that only shreds of paper remained. I remember asking, "Who is standing next to Mom in this picture?" My grandfather glanced at it, then took it from my hands. "No one important," he said softly, slipping it into his coat pocket and walking away. I didn't push. I didn't question. Because I loved them. Because they were all I had. Because even when something felt wrong, I didn't want it to be. I didn't want the people who'd raised me to be liars. I didn't want to believe that behind their warm smiles, something colder lived. But the truth is, I always knew something wasn't right. I just didn't have the words yet. It wasn't until I turned 16 that those whispers grew louder. That the cracks in the story they told me started splitting open. The memories came in flashes, sounds, smells, shadows. And they didn't match the life they'd painted so carefully. I remember one night, I had a nightmare. In it, I was hiding under a table. My mother was screaming. A glass shattered. And a man's voice said something I still can't forget. "If you walk out that door, don't bother coming back." When I woke up, I was drenched in sweat, shaking. I told my grandmother. She looked pale, then smiled too quickly. "Oh, sweetheart, just a bad dream. You must have heard that in a movie." But I hadn't. I knew that voice. I knew that table. I just didn't know how. The next day, I went up to the attic. Not to find something. Just to remember. Instead, I found something that would change everything. A small metal box hidden beneath old quilts. Inside it, my mother's journal. Old. Fragile. Smelling like dust and grief. The first page had a date and her handwriting, and it read, "If anyone ever finds this, I pray they believe me, because I can't live this lie much longer." That was the moment my world began to shake. Not because I'd found the truth, but because deep down, I realized I'd been raised by the very people who made her write that. The hands that fed me, loved me, tucked me in at night, were the same hands that made my mother afraid to live. And that was only the beginning. After I found my mother's journal, I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. And for the first time since I was 5, I didn't hug them back when they said goodnight. The words in her diary weren't wild or dramatic. They were soft, terrified, trapped. She wrote about being silenced, about how her parents, my grandparents, controlled everything. From who she talked to where she went, to how she dressed. She was in her 20s, but she described her life like she was still a prisoner in her childhood home. One line shattered me more than anything else. "They say they're protecting me, but from what? The world? Or the truth?" That question burned into my soul. Because for the first time, I didn't feel protected. I felt trapped, just like she had. I started asking questions. Carefully at first. "Grandma, what was mom like at my age?" "Oh, sweet girl. So bright, so gentle, but too emotional. She always needed saving." I asked my grandfather, "Did she ever talk about wanting to move away?" His eyes twitched. "Why would she want to leave family?" Every answer was wrapped in guilt-tripping sugar. Every pause in their stories stretched just a second too long. They were hiding something. And suddenly, I couldn't stop pulling the thread. At school, I asked an old teacher of mine who also taught my mother. She blinked when I mentioned her name. "Your mother was brilliant. A bit quiet, but smart. Kind. She was going to get a scholarship out of town, wasn't she?" My heart sank. Scholarship? No one had ever mentioned that. I went to the town library, dug through dusty yearbooks, and there she was, my mother. Valedictorian. Honor roll. Voted most likely to succeed. I stared at her smile and realized it didn't match the story I'd been fed my whole life. I asked more people in town, people who used to know our family. Most dodged the questions. Some gave vague answers. But one changed everything. It was a neighbor I barely remembered, a woman named Carla who used to babysit me when I was a toddler. I found her at the local farmer's market. When I said who I was, she froze. Her eyes welled up. "You're Emma's daughter," she whispered. Then she hugged me, tight like she was holding a ghost. "You don't remember that night, do you?" I stepped back. "What night?" Her face went white. She looked around nervously, then leaned in. "Forget I said anything." "No. Please. Tell me." She looked so sad. So scared. Then she said the words that cracked me open. "Your mom tried to run. That night. She came to me. She was crying. Begged me to hide her. Said they threatened her. Said she couldn't take it anymore." My throat tightened. Carla whispered. "The next day, they said she jumped off the bridge. But she would have never left you behind." Tears fell from her eyes. And mine. I walked home in silence. My shoes felt like they were made of cement. My chest, like it was full of ice. They said she died in a car crash. Now, someone else says she jumped. And the journal said she wanted to escape. Which one was true? Or were they all lies? That night, I searched the house. Every drawer. Every closet. Every forgotten cabinet. I found a locked box in my grandfather's workshop. It took me 2 hours to break it open. Inside were documents, police records, old photos, court notices, and one autopsy report. The cause of death: blunt force trauma. No confirmed witness to fall. Bruises consistent with defensive wounds. No mention of a car crash. No accident. Just silence. covered with paperwork and fake condolences. I stared at the words until the letters blurred. The girl who once believed her grandparents were angels was now standing in the middle of a crime scene that was never investigated. I confronted them the next morning. I didn't say a word. I just laid the report in front of them. My grandmother's hands trembled. My grandfather stared at me like I was someone else. Then she whispered, "Why were you looking where you shouldn't?" Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "Let us explain." Just, "Blame." My voice cracked. "You lied to me. My whole life. About her. About everything." My grandfather's jaw clenched. "Your mother wasn't well. She made bad choices. We protected you from the mess she created." "She wasn't the mess," I said. "You were." Their silence said more than words ever could. And in that silence, my rage was born. That night, I sat with my mother's journal in one hand and their photograph in the other. Two worlds. Two lies. One truth. They didn't save me. They stole me. And now, I was going to make sure the world saw who they really were. I couldn't unsee it. Couldn't unread those words. Couldn't unhear their silence. After that morning, the house didn't feel like home anymore. Every corner whispered a lie. Every photo frame looked like a mask. And the two people I once called my world now looked like strangers in familiar skin. I stayed quiet for a few days. Observed them. Watched how quickly they returned to their routines, like nothing had happened. My grandmother still made tea at exactly 6 a.m. My grandfather still read the newspaper with the same fake calm, as if their secrets hadn't just bled through the wallpaper. But I wasn't the same girl anymore. I carried her journal everywhere now, my mother's voice in my bag, her pain in my chest. Every time I flipped the pages, she came alive again. The way she wrote about music, her dreams, her fears. And the way those dreams were suffocated in the very house I was still sleeping in. She wasn't weak. She wasn't unstable. She was trapped. She mentioned someone, only once. No name. Just initials, DM. The entry read, "Dim." Gave me hope. But hope is dangerous when you're being watched. They saw. They always see. Who was DM? I started digging again. Old yearbooks. Local newspapers. I eventually found a school newsletter from the year she graduated. There was an article about a student winning a state music scholarship, Daniel Marks. He and my mother were in the same class. She played piano. He played violin. I stared at the picture of them together, young, laughing, eyes full of something that looked like possibility. I recognized that look, because I never saw it in the eyes of the woman who raised me. I had to find him. The address was out of town. He ran a small music school now. The next weekend, I lied. Told my grandparents I was visiting a college campus with friends. Instead, I boarded a bus with trembling hands and a racing heart. I found him on a quiet street, in a building that smelled like varnished wood and memories. When I said my mother's name, his face froze. "You're Emma's daughter?" His voice cracked on the word, Emma. We sat. He made tea chamomile like she used to drink. And for the first time in my life, I heard the truth. Without filters. Without excuses. She wanted to leave. "We were going to run away together," he whispered. But then, they found out. Her parents. They came to my house, threatened my family, said she was mentally unstable, that if I kept seeing her, they'd report her for child neglect, for endangering you. My eyes stung. He added, she was scared, not of the world, but of them. That was the moment I realized. My mother didn't die. She was erased. And now, I knew exactly what I had to do. End of part 3. When I returned home from meeting Daniel, I wasn't the same girl who had left. I walked into that house with my mother's truth echoing inside me like a war drum. Every smile my grandparents gave me now looked like a weapon. Because that's what they used to destroy her, kindness coded in control. That night, I stared across the dinner table, watching them laugh, watching them pretend. And suddenly, I understood why she felt like she was drowning in a home filled with air. They didn't raise me out of love. They raised me to rewrite the story they buried. They stood frozen as the deputy handed over the reopening notice. The investigation into my mother's death had officially begun. I was in the room when it happened, right behind them, close enough to hear my grandmother's breath hitch, close enough to see my grandfather's knuckles turn white as he gripped the paper like it might crumble the life they built. And I didn't say a word. I just watched. Watched the castle of lies start to crack. The next few days were chaos, but the kind that moved in silence. Phone calls behind closed doors. Whispers that ended the moment I entered the room. They didn't confront me. Didn't ask me why or how. Because deep down, they already knew. The sheriff interviewed me again. I gave every detail. Even the things I hadn't planned to say, like how they used to lock certain doors when I was a child. Or how I remembered faint shouting in the middle of the night when I was 4. A woman crying. My mother's voice. Memories I'd once chalked up to nightmares were no longer just dreams. They were evidence. I kept recording them. Even as they started treating me differently, less affection, more suspicion. One night, I heard my grandfather say something through the crack of their door. She's too much like her mother. That's going to be a problem. That was all I needed. Because he was right. I was like her now. But with one key difference. She was silenced. And I was about to scream loud enough for the world to hear. The town started whispering. Old friends came forward with stories. My mother had once told a coworker she was scared to go home. Another neighbor remembered a night of police sirens and screaming, followed by silence and a closed casket funeral. Every little detail chipped away at the mask my grandparents had worn so perfectly. And then the sheriff called me with something that made my blood freeze. We found something buried behind the house. A locked box. Containing bloody clothing. It's being tested now. My knees gave out. Buried behind the house. Where I used to play as a child. Where my mother used to garden. Her truth had been hidden. Just beneath my feet. I didn't confront them. Not yet. Instead, I began planning something else. A memorial. Not for them. For her. A real one. I invited people who remembered her. Not the version my grandparents painted, but the truth. Old friends. Daniel. Even the sheriff. I hosted it at the community hall. Filled it with photos of her smile, her journal entries, her music. And I gave a speech. I was raised by people who told me my mother was fragile. Lost. Gone too soon by accident or fate. But the truth? She wasn't fragile. She was silenced. She wasn't lost. She was taken. And now, after all these years, her story is finally being told. By the daughter they tried to erase her from. People cried. People listened. And most importantly, people believed. That night, I walked back home, opened the front door, and stood there in silence as my grandparents looked up at me. I held the program from the memorial in my hand, dropped it on the table in front of them. She finally got the goodbye you never let her have. My grandmother's eyes welled up, but I didn't feel pity, only justice sharpening its claws. Because I knew something they didn't. The DNA test came back. And that box they buried. It wasn't just hers. It had his blood on it too. And now, their lives were about to be buried deeper than anything they could dig their way out of. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was scared, but because the silence in that house had turned loud. Every creak of the floorboard, every ticking second of the old grandfather clock, it all screamed of the secrets that had lived here far too long. I kept thinking about that box. The soil it was buried in. The hands that placed it there. How calmly they must have walked back inside, washed their hands, and kissed me goodnight. The police came back 2 days later. This time, they brought a warrant. I sat on the porch as they searched the house room by room, and I watched my grandparents fall apart without saying a word. Grandpa tried to stay composed, even made coffee for the officers. But Grandma, she started trembling the moment they opened the basement. That was her space. The locked room we were never allowed to enter as kids. She said it was unsafe, too many cleaning supplies. But when they opened that door, it wasn't bleach or mops they found. It was a burned photo album, one that held only pictures of my mother. Every single page. Scorched. Deliberate. The sheriff looked at me with eyes full of regret. This isn't just about violence. This was erasure. And that's when it hit me. They didn't just want her gone. They wanted her unremembered. They had spent years curating the perfect story. That she had been sick. That motherhood broke her. That they were her saviors. But every detail they hid, every memory they destroyed, only made the truth louder. After the search, the sheriff pulled me aside. There will be charges. Maybe not murder, yet, but obstruction, tampering, concealing evidence. The court will decide the rest. I nodded. I didn't need handcuffs to feel like justice was beginning. What I needed was for the world to know. So, I did what they never expected. I turned the house into a museum. No joke. I contacted a local journalist who had attended my mother's memorial. Told him I wanted to do a story. Not just an article, an expose. We filmed every room. Showed the burned album. The letters. The journal. I spoke on camera, not with tears, but with fire. My grandparents wore masks for decades. They fooled neighbors, the church, even the law. But they couldn't fool me forever. This house may have killed her, but now it speaks her name louder than they ever allowed. The video went viral. People across the country sent messages of support. Some even shared stories of their own silent abusers. How their pain was dismissed because the abuser wore a smile. My grandparents stopped speaking to me. They stayed in their room most days. Didn't argue. Didn't threaten. Because now, the world was watching. And I didn't stop there. I created a scholarship fund in her name for girls in abusive homes who dreamed of escaping through art, like she did with her music. Daniel offered to teach lessons for free. Her story, once buried, was now a beacon. But there was still one piece left. Something I hadn't yet done. Something that burned in my chest every time I walked past her old room. I had to confront them. Not with police. Not with cameras. Just with words. I stood in the living room. Called them both down. They moved slowly, cautiously, as if I had become the threat now. Good. They sat across from me, and I finally said, "You lied to me my entire life. You painted her as broken. But she wasn't. You were. You punished her for loving, for dreaming, for fighting. And when you couldn't control her, you destroyed her." My grandfather opened his mouth to speak, but I raised a hand. No. This isn't your turn anymore. I reached into my bag, pulled out the journal, laid it on the table. She speaks now. Not you. Then I walked away. Out of that house. Out of their shadow. And for the first time, I didn't look back. I never expected the battle to end quietly. After that confrontation, the house felt colder, emptier. My grandparents retreated into their silence, a silence that felt like a slow burning punishment. But I was no longer the scared girl who hid behind their lies. I filed more reports. I handed over recordings, proof of their calculated cruelty. Each day, the weight on my chest lifted just a little. The community started to shift. People who once whispered behind closed doors began to speak openly. I got messages from others who had suffered in silence, thanking me for breaking the cycle. But the hardest part wasn't the investigation. It wasn't the court dates or the cold stares from relatives. It was the quiet moments when I realized that even after all the truth came out, the scars they left on me wouldn't just vanish. I found myself walking past my mother's old room and wondering if she had fought this war alone. How does she keep her light shining? I realized then that my fight was bigger than just justice. It was about healing, about reclaiming my own life. And though the court was preparing to take my grandparents to trial, I knew the true battle was within me. One night, I sat down at the piano she once played. My fingers hesitated over the keys, unsure, shaky. But then, a single note rang out, soft, trembling. And I played. For her. For me. For all the silent souls trapped in houses like mine. Because sometimes, the loudest revenge isn't breaking walls or shouting truths. It's finding your voice after it's been stolen. Months passed. The trial began. The world watched as my grandparents sat silently in the courtroom, faces etched with guilt they couldn't hide. But here's the truth they never expected. I wasn't broken anymore. Every testimony I gave chipped away at the walls they built around their lies. Every piece of evidence was a brick pulled from their fortress of cruelty. The jury saw the truth. The judge saw the truth. And so did I. But the real victory wasn't in the verdict that sentenced them to years behind bars. It was in the moment I finally stood alone in the empty house, the place where her life was stolen. I walked through every room, breathed in the ghosts, and whispered, "You don't have power over me anymore." Then, I lit a candle in her memory and let it burn bright, lighting the darkness that once swallowed us whole. Because sometimes, revenge isn't about pain or punishment. It's about freedom. Freedom to live, to heal, to rise. And as I stepped outside into the sunlight, I realized the silence had finally ended.